Welcome back to Garden Studio. I'm Tessa Pinner, a designer and gardener in upstate South Carolina, Zone 8A. Today's episode is all about ground covers. This is a very practical topic. We all have to think about, it's kind of like underwear. We all have to have the ground covers. We all have to cover our bases, as it were. So there are a couple of different kinds of ground covers. Obviously there is lawn. That's not the topic for today's video. I am going to lean into evergreen ground covers, the kind of thing you think of when someone says, I just need a ground cover here, something to hold the space, and usually planted all as a single species. And then of course there's a second category. Anything that is blocking light from hitting the soil is a ground cover, and we can be creative in other ways with mixing plants that aren't usually considered that typical ground cover category. This is such a practical topic because when you have open ground, any ground that sunlight can hit, you have weeds and you have to manually mulch it. So in my own garden and in the gardens I design, I always like to move in the direction of covering every square inch with a plant that will grow together over time. This will cut down extremely on the amount of weed pressure you have to deal with and make your maintenance in the long term in your garden spaces so much easier. To start out, I'm going to show you a few examples of ground covers used at my property. I know how helpful it is to have a list. And because I don't have every example here in my own garden, I will include some helpful guide lists at the end, basically by function and by light exposure. There are some amazing plants like different carexes. That's a grass-like plant that I don't have good examples of here in my garden, maybe someday. But there are a lot of things I've used in my design work that I can't show you physical examples here, but I can put them in a list for you to go do a little bit more of your own research. And so that is a resource I'll provide at the end of this video. So in this path garden here, I have used a ground cover that usually would be considered a pretty aggressive, thuggish friend and not one you would want to mix in a perennial setting, but I have done it with really robust perennials here. This is a kind of salvia. I've got iris. I have a couple of things in pots. There are 2 large terracotta pots in this bed, things that are raised out of the ground cover plane. Peonies do fine with an aggressive ground cover. Really anything, the irises basically stand all year, but anything that can punch through could stand with this jasmine. It's also very helpful under a large tree. In a designed setting, this is one that can tolerate root competition if it gets water. So down towards the coast, you'll often see this jasmine underplanted with the huge, gorgeous live oaks and given a pretty butch military type haircut to keep it in check because it does tend to trail. Specifically, this cultivar Snow in Summer has the new foliage that turns white, pink, and speckled in the sun. So this gives the appearance of blooms even though it's not a blooming plant. It's evergreen. Basically, it is kept in check by the mower coming around the edge, otherwise it would want to creep out into the lawn. So that brings me to a second kind of similar useful thug plant, and that is this Vinca minor, Asiatic Vinca. And this has pretty little periwinkle flowers in the spring. That's really not the point of the plant. It is glossy, evergreen foliage that kind of mounds up to 18 to 20 inches and forms a sort of pillowy cover. This is really nice the way we have it here under large trees. It gives an option where the lawn wouldn't grow. So this is not an extremely exciting plant, but it is a nice solution, and it is just also kept in place by mowing. So if you have a wooded area where you're trying to figure out, okay, I can't grow lawn here, what can I do? I don't have the capacity to make this a really intensely gardened space, vinca might be an option. In this case, we inherited the vinca. I didn't choose it, it was here, and I have come to appreciate it more over time because it does such a good job solving this issue for us of what we would do on the ground plane in an area like this that's pretty challenging. So you can see also it forms a nice skirt under that hedge. And that is yet another function of ground covers. It's not just that an open area needs a ground cover. Under trees, under shrubs, anything that is not occupying that ground layer itself needs a ground layer. Otherwise, it would just be full of weeds. And as it is, it's a very calming thing to look at. It's all one thing. Is it incredibly diverse? No. Does it harbor wildlife and provide a habitat for them? Yes, it does. I have here two more examples of very common, useful workhorse ground covers. This is Liriope spicata, the spreading Liriope. And you can see that it's traveling up into this shade garden bed. This is one that will run if you don't have a physical barrier containing it or you're not keeping it in place with mowing. So having this anywhere near a bed is a tough maintenance issue. I did not put it here. I've just been grandfathered into the maintenance of it. So I would say if you have a space that you want a grass-like look, it's a very nice contrast to an actual short-cut grass to have this long bladed foliage, and it is a shade plant. And this is mondo grass. So a similar kind of look, but a much finer textured foliage. This can take more sun and it doesn't run in the same way. It's actually quite expensive to do areas of this because it grows together. It fills in the gaps quite slowly, which does make the maintenance over time easier. It's a very kind of classic look to have a petticoat under planting other things like boxwoods or hydrangeas with something like mondo grass. It's always a beautiful dark green color. There is a dwarf mondo I will show you next. These little tufts here are dwarf mondo. This is as tall as it gets, and this grows even slower. So these will eventually, in about 100 years, all clump together, and I'll probably add more over time. I basically just sprigged them in. This is a great option for very small areas because it grows so slowly. And it doesn't really function on a large scale. You stand back from it and it looks humpy just because of how the plant grows in these little tussocks. So it's very ideally suited if you want a difference, almost like a pattern. If you had a paving, maybe let's say a paving square, and you wanted a square of something green next to it that was solid and indestructible, could be walked on, this would be a good option for that. This plant is sweet woodruff, Gallium odorose. That's what I get for trying to be fancy. We'll just leave it at sweet woodruff. This is sweet woodruff, and it is originally from Eastern Europe, I believe, but it has these beautiful little white flowers, and it's just such an interesting shape. This does very well in a partly shaded or woodland setting as a ground cover. It can be a bit aggressive. Wire vine, believe it or not, is a really good ground cover. It can kind of romp over things and it spills nicely, but if you have some rocks to grow something over, it does take a good bit of sun if it's given water. Then this is a very useful plant. This is strawberry begonia, and look at that beautiful veining. This will cover a hillside that has partial sun. So some sun, some shade, and it's under here forming a mat under these other things. You can see how if you want to note on the plant habit, this is what the sweet woodruff is doing. Actually, once or twice a season, I come in and pull it out because it is more aggressive than the strawberry begonia. And I think that is a useful thing to note. Over here, it's a little bit hard to tell. under this clover that I need to weed through, but this is woodland sedum right here. This is a evergreen sedum that takes shade. It's a native. And this is a great one for around boulders and rocks in a shady area. It is not going to be foot traffic tolerant. I mean, it will break off and come back, but there's a much shorter list of ground covers you can walk on than ground covers that will just seal the ground. But these, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 in a little tiny space right there that are all evergreen and will all cover the ground in a part shade or shade environment. This is another unconventional use of a plant people don't really think of as a ground cover, but this is another native, Virginia creeper. You can see it in the distance going up the magnolia tree, but it has also populated the ground layer of the bed. And look how pretty the contrast of this big, bold kind of palmate foliage is next to a lawn, you know, and also a dandelion. But this is a great option for a native leaning garden if you have an area that you're not trying to do a whole lot of things on ground level with lots of little fussy perennials, because this will romp right over them. But let's say you have trees and shrubs. You want a native ground cover that will be able to be kept in place with mowing. You don't mind if it climbs some of the trees. There is a little bit of maintenance involved, but it turns a gorgeous scarlety color in the fall. So it's not totally evergreen, but I do like what it's doing here. It's not one you're going to read about in a book to tell you to do this, but if you are looking for a more ecologically minded option, that could be for you. So this variegated friend here is also periwinkle, the Asian vinca, but it is something I planted before I had as much plant knowledge as I do now, and it is a very difficult one to keep tidy. So in this spot, I really need tidy. At some point, I will go in and I will remove it. This is much better suited to a large space. The scale of how the foliage does these long kind of twiny arms, it just isn't, it's not good for a small tidy space. This would be much better suited in something like mondo grass. So although I like the color, it's hard to keep in check. Just wanted to show this as a ground cover being one of those functional things. It really has a job to do, and either it's working well or it isn't. This ground cover at the edge of the stone here is creeping phlox. This is an ideal spot for it. Stone really shows off creeping phlox beautifully. This particular one blooms white, very early spring, but they also come in pink, an icy blue, a purple, and they are especially good they just look really good with rock. This is not something you would probably do in a huge area, but it's great around stones, in a pathway, tumbling over a wall. It has a little bit of graceful movement to it. And here it's the backing for my bench stone.
So here is the list that I promised you, split up into two main categories of sun and shade. I included mostly spreading ground covers on this list because that is usually what we're thinking of when we're trying to solve and fill an area. There could be an entire different episode on plants that simply live at the ground layer. To me, is a different discussion. So this list specifically is to help you solve problems, make your life a little easier if you have a spot to fill and you can't do it with the grass, or I would argue want something more interesting than grass, don't need it for the function of turf, then these could be really helpful options for you to think about.
Mulching is no one's favorite task, and one of the principal benefits of ground covers is that they reduce the area that you have to do that repeated maintenance that makes caring for a garden or a property feel unsustainable. I hope this gives you ideas of ways to cover your ground and fight weeds in beautiful, interesting, dynamic ways that aren't just mulch. which is something you have to buy year after year, season after season. It's literally dying, where the ground cover can be a living, functional layer in your garden. Thanks for watching. I hope this was a helpful introduction to the topic of ground covers and that you have a few extra ideas in your arsenal to go approach those problem areas at your own garden. Have a great week.